Good evening and welcome to Middlesex Update. I'm Melissa Hurley. Since we've last met with you, our world has changed as we once knew it. When the tragic events of September 11th happened, I sat down with my producer, Joe Fortunato, and we too thought about what resources we had to offer to our friends, the public. And we thought about it and we decided to do what Middlesex Update does best. For the past 10 years, Middlesex Update has earned recognition as an award-winning television program because we bring you the local stories, the human interest stories you just won't find on your nightly news. For the past 10 years, starting off as Medford Square TV and now as Middlesex Update, we've interviewed international leaders. In fact, some of our interviews have been shown on what would be comparable to Pakistan's CNN or ABC News. And tonight, we're going to meet once again with a man who has very close ties to the Commonwealth. He has spent many years living here. He's taught at Harvard, he's taught at Tufts, and he's acted as a consultant and ambassador to the Pakistan government in dealing with U.S. relations. Dr. Farooq Hassan joins me here tonight on Middlesex Update. And Dr. Hassan, first of all, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much.
I know you just arrived in Boston a few days ago, and it must have been a little bit of a touch and go when you got on the plane. You know, nowadays when people get on planes just to go an hour, they're thinking about their life and thinking about the future. But we're very glad to have you here.
Thank you.
And Dr. Hassan, we've met with you a few times. You've been on the program. You actually are an international speaker. You spoke about human rights, and you're a professor and attorney by trade. In fact, one thing I have to say is I usually see you with Senator Kennedy. You're always talking to him about when he really comes to you to talk to you about Pakistan and how the U.S. and Pakistan can work together. So it's nice to have you here again. You also have a book that I didn't realize you were also an author. We pride ourselves on Middlesex Update on having authors on many times, so we'll talk about that tonight too. But you just returned from Pakistan, and tell me about the mood over there after September 11th.
Well, first of all, I am very glad to be here today. As you have mentioned, I recently flew from Pakistan, and flying this time was so different, and it was a terrifying experience, really, even to enter the aeroplane. And so getting here was by itself quite a satisfactory psychological thing for me. As far as the mood is concerned, invariably it has to be said that the tragedy of the 11th September has had a very heavy impact on the entire world community. And Pakistan is no exception. Perhaps it has been felt more acutely in Pakistan, for the simple reason that amongst the countries of the world, my native country has had more experience as a victim of terrorism than I suppose any other country. For the last so many years, we have 5, 10, 15, 20 people killed every day. So when we saw on the television news that in one go so many thousands had been killed, we all felt very, very sorry. And so our sympathies went out and our prayers went out to those who had been afflicted.
Right.
So therefore there is no question that at the public and general level there has been a tremendous outpouring of affection for what has happened to the Americans.
And we were talking a little bit off camera about, I was just talking to you about downtown Boston, talking about the State House, and you know, they used to have 21 entrances, now they just have 3. Downtown Crossing, Government Center, there's barricades up there, and everywhere you go there's a police presence, a military presence, and what I think sometimes us as citizens of the United States, we don't realize that in other countries that's a way of life. And tell me what it's like to walk down, you know, your main streets of Pakistan. It's a little bit different than it is or has been here.
Quite. I think this is a good point you have made, because what happened here on the 11th of September has in some ways been happening in other world parts more frequently. And it has actually become, regrettably, a very sad part of our lives. As I just said, in Pakistan we have had lots of victims of terrorism, and sooner or later the life has to go on as it is. And I think in a practical sense, in a pragmatic sense, these barriers and so on don't really achieve the purpose for which they are put there. Because no matter what you do, if somebody is determined to bypass that, he will find some method to do it. And I think in the process, the human difficulties of the people living an ordinary life are exacerbated enormously. And I think this is a matter that has to be decided as a practical life matter of everyday existence. And I think efforts have to be made to get on with the life. And I was very glad to see President Bush say the other day on the television, for example, it was a light comment, but it was a very earthly comment when he said, go to shop. People should get out. And I was today out in Boston going to the bank, and it was like entering Fort Knox. So if that kind of psychological milieu is set up, I think ordinary life will become very difficult. So I think we have to approach this matter in a more robust, humane manner and overcome this fear that has been permeated by this enormous tragedy of 11th of September.
Right, and as we said earlier, you've worked very closely with the Pakistani government. Pakistan agreed to help the United States, and one thing that I think as Americans, everyone just couldn't understand why it took them a little bit of time to think about it, and what does this mean they're going to help the United States? How much would they really support the U.S.?
First of all, for any country to help the United States in normal circumstances would not be a difficult thing. But Pakistan has had a roller coaster kind of relationship with the United States. For a long time, since Mr. Dulles was the foreign secretary of this country 50 years ago, Pakistan was the only ally of this country in the world. And in 1962, when Gary Powers was shot down over Moscow, he had flown the U-2 spy planes from Pakistan. And Pakistan therefore had provided to the United States military bases not even known to the people of Pakistan or anywhere else in the world for that matter. But thereafter, the relationship became somewhat sour. I don't want to go into the reasons of that in this program, but the fact is that they didn't remain that good, despite the fact that Pakistan had in a way offered its own security at stake, being considered ostensibly against the Russians, which were not the neighbors of Pakistan. Then in 1972 came the trip of Dr. Henry Kissinger to China, and Pakistan was a key player in that arrangement. So again, the relationship of the United States and Pakistan became very high. And a year before that, in 1971, I came to New York, and I was in the Security Council, and I saw President then Mr. Bush, who was then the U.S. representative and ambassador to the UN, make a speech for the United States in that Security Council meeting when Pakistan was under attack from India for the crisis that then led to the creation of Bangladesh. So Pakistan's relationship was good, and again after that it went bad, and ultimately in 1979, when the Russians invaded Afghanistan and we had President Zia-ul-Haq in Pakistan, the relationship again became a little better, and they went on becoming better. So much so that during the 80s, Pakistan was the major friend of the United States in any country in the whole world. And Pakistan was basically responsible, I think, in a historical sense, for the demise of the Soviet Union. Had it not been for Pakistan, Soviet Union might not have disintegrated, and it was through Afghanistan. But look what happened. I was then the advisor to the Prime Minister of Pakistan in 1987, and we saw that suddenly the aid to Pakistan was cut off for various reasons. And that position has remained more or less accordingly in the same format, that right now when Pakistan was asked for helping the United States on the 11th of September, Pakistan again had sanctions imposed against it. So the role that Pakistan is playing has to be seen in that context, that it was not a country which had received a quid pro quo, a reciprocity of friendship, and it had changed from time to time. So from that angle, I think it has been very powerful and a very progressive kind of thinking by the Pakistan government. But once I say this, I have to go a little deeper into this, what I have just said. When I say that Pakistan has agreed to help the United States, we have to divulge or disclose that there is a dichotomy here. At the government level, I think the government has said what you have seen, that they would help the United States. At the public level, that anger or that resentment is still there, that till recently we were under sanctions.
Right, what I was wondering is, the government says one thing, but how do the people feel?
Exactly. So I was just going to go on to that point, that the people in Pakistan, I think, are not what the government is telling this country. I have seen in the press that the government of Pakistan under General Musharraf has told the world that 90% of the people are with him. I don't think that's true by a long chalk. It's not true at all. In fact, I think if honestly a referendum of some kind was taken, I think more people are against General Musharraf doing what he's doing. It has nothing to do with the tragedy as such.
Right.
It is simply a historical look into what the relationship has been. And then,
I think it would be a safety concern as well.
Exactly.
For those people, because those are the people that are living there each and every day. They have to go on, go do work, go to school, what have you, and there's definitely a reason to believe there'd be an attack.
Right. This is the third thing that I want to point out while answering this question. It's a good thing you have pointed out, that the government is immune from being attacked, but the people are not.
Right.
And these people who have dared to attack within the heartland of United States, would they spare an ordinary Pakistani?
Right.
No. I think if they had their way, they would create havoc. And Pakistan's population is the target that would, I think, emerge eventually. So I see that the ordinary people in Pakistan are very uneasy. I tell you, when I was in Pakistan till 2-3 days ago, I was receiving emails from my friends in the United States, from Australia, from Germany, from Italy, to get out of Pakistan. And I wrote back to them. I said, why should I get out of Pakistan? What's wrong here? There's no going to be any bombardment here. And they said, no, it is not the American bombers that are going to hit you. It is these mullahs and the Taliban people that are going to come after anyone they think is high profile or pro-America or has some connection in America or foreign educated. So that is the kind of turmoil that I foresee in these countries. And if that is not checked, it can lead to all kinds of circumstances. We could have a government toppled by such upheavals. We could have a government substituted by a different form of government. And we could actually end up having much wider civil disobedience than we can even contemplate to meet with. And this is not only true in Pakistan, this is also true, I think, for the surrounding areas. And I think that is something that has to be kept in mind.
You're very knowledgeable. It's interesting to hear someone who lives over there and can talk for the people, because another thing they were talking about is that since all this tragedy in America, everyone is wondering, the bookstores have been flooded with requests about Islamic religions, about Afghanistan, about Pakistan, because for so many years, although these countries were doing their own, holding their own and doing their own part with different governments and so forth, it's kind of like out of sight, out of mind. The American people weren't dealing with them directly, so now they're hearing about these countries that all of a sudden becoming players in their minds, and it's nice to hear from someone who can tell firsthand experiences. Let's talk a little bit about the Afghanistan Taliban. In your opinion, does the Afghanistan Taliban regime genuinely represent fundamentalist Islam?
In one way, when we speak of fundamentalism, we are speaking of those people who are very strict doctrinaires. In that sense, yes, the Taliban do represent that. But then, if I might add very quickly, there are several countries that are of the same perspective as far as doctrine is concerned. The parent country, if I may call it such, is Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is the country that actually financed, after the Americans' withdrawal in 1990, the establishment of the Taliban regime. They are being funded by the Saudi Arabian government. Not because they were doing bad things at that time, that has nothing to do with it. It's simply a religious matter, because these people are the most strict adherents of the fundamentalist outlook. But then they are fundamentalists in Pakistan, and they are fundamentalists in other countries. So therefore, I think one has to keep in mind that the Taliban's religious beliefs of being a fundamentalist kind of people is very true. But then these kind of movements are being financed and supported by countries beyond their borders, and as I've said, we have to keep in mind the kind of support that they are receiving. Now, I might add here that Pakistan, for example, is a very modern country in some ways, but in terms of religion, I don't think it is any less fundamentalist in that sense than Afghanistan is. And that is seen by the fact that recently you saw on the television that on the 27th of September, the government of Pakistan organized what they called a Solidarity Day.
Right.
But to make it a success, what did they do? They brought out on the streets government servants and school children and on government-acquired buses to make the show look more impressive. It didn't fool anyone, because those that they wanted to outshine had much greater and vociferous presence in some cities without all these trappings. And in fact, many of these outpourings of ordinary people were stopped by the government. So I think we have to keep in mind that the government of Pakistan is really not being fair either to its own people or even to the international community on that score, because one has to gauge and know the truth. Because unless you know what the reality is, you really cannot even espouse the remedy. And I think the point we are now discussing is a very fundamental one. The extent to which the action proposed to be taken in Afghanistan will or will not sustain and obtain initially the support of the people. The government might be all for America, but I think the next question, whether the public will support it, is far from satisfactory. And I can tell you, once the bombs start flying in Afghanistan and there are few casualties, you have heard of the same story for the soldiers from the West, that when the few body bags come back, it creates a different atmosphere. Well, this is going to create a much far greater and serious atmosphere in that region, and it's going to probably lead to a great deal of destability. I don't know where that destability will end up, but Pakistan is itself at the brink of immense crisis potential.
Okay. Well then, why did the Pakistan military government agree to help the U.S. against the Taliban when they were created by Islamabad?
Now that is a question that is easy to answer. After the withdrawal of the Soviet Union in 1988 and the de facto withdrawal of the United States from the scene, I was actually a lawyer in that phase when the Geneva Accords were signed in 1988. Geneva Accords were the accords which finalized the withdrawal of the Soviet Union from Afghanistan. And Pakistan at that time had insisted to the Americans that you create a government here. But I am very sorry to say that at that time the United States said, we have nothing to do with the establishment of the government. We have nothing to do with this. So the Americans withdrew rather hastily after having succeeded in expelling the Russians. So what happened? There was enormous amount of arsenal of very dangerous kind in the country. There were all these warlords running around. There were all these people without really any leadership and no government. So that was the kind of scenario that Pakistan had to deal with. So I think it goes to the sagacity, it goes to the foreign policy excellence of the country in a short period of time at least, in which they were able to create successive stable governments in the Afghanistan country. But then what happened was that within Afghanistan, these governments that were established as a result of various accords, they are known by the name of the Peshawar Accords, the Islamabad Accords, could not survive. And the Northern Alliance that now exists, which is now on the brink of receiving some aid from the Western countries, was the one that was ousted by the Americans. So it's ironical that the government they oust, the people they oust, are now being invited to topple the ones that they supported. And more importantly, there is a very strict matter that has to be kept in mind, that these people in the Northern Alliance are the former protégés of the Russians. They are basically the relics of the communist era. So I find that very hard that that kind of a coalition is now being supported, and Russia is also supporting it. against the kind of people that itself was created by particularly the Western countries. So Pakistan is the main conduit, if you will, that created this establishment. Now, that is the reason that I find it very difficult to agree, no matter how many times the government of Pakistan says so, that they will really go after the Afghanistan government. I don't think so the government of Pakistan can afford to. And I doubt very much if the Pakistan army will ever take any action to please the United States against the Taliban government. And I think that dichotomy, if you will, has to be kept in mind by policymakers. There was this suspicion, if you remember, after the 11th, when the United States made overtures towards various countries for assistance. Pakistan did not respond immediately. It took 2-3 days. And during that period, President Bush was asked, Secretary of State Powell was asked, what about Pakistan? And they all said, we don't know, we wait what will happen. In other words, the response of Pakistan government was not spontaneous, it was considered. Now, what made them choose the route they did? I think there are two main reasons. First is that the government of Pakistan itself right now is a military government. It is not an elected government.
Right.
So therefore, a government which itself is under legal challenge, has a lot of suspicions on its own legality, has in a way denied its own people the right of franchise, the right of representation in an elected assembly, can hardly speak with that kind of a determined dogmatic style in what it is going to do somewhere else. And in that period that this government has been there, and I have been trying to help this government to get to the stage that they can pass on the mantle of authority to an elected government. I argued a case in which the Supreme Court held so. So I think people like me are helping this government to take a positive stand towards a civilian rule. But the fact still remains that the government was not recognized as such, even by the United States. And there are sanctions imposed against this very government under the United States Foreign Appropriations Act, Section 508, which forbids the United States from assisting any government which is of a military type. So I think the question you asked me, why government agreed, was basically this, to get immediate recognition, which it has succeeded to get. And I think that's a good thing in a way. But that still doesn't solve the problem that we started with. Are we going to create a regime in which such things are condoned, overlooked for the kind of problem that we are certainly faced with? After all, we have to remember that President Bush said that we are particularly fighting a war for human rights and democracy.
Right.
So democracy is an issue here. And I think all actions that follow from here should keep that in mind.
You wrote a book a few years ago, The Islamic Republic, Politics, Law, and Economy. And tell me a little bit about this book.
Well, this is a book I wrote towards the end of the Afghan war in 1980s. And this is the first book of its kind in modern times in which the doctrinal basis of what an Islamic state has been examined. And I examine in this the doctrinal overtures that such a state will take. I might mention here that in 1980s I had volunteered then to President Carter, who was the president, and to the State Department, that I would assist them in formulating a policy towards such matters, because I knew the background of this subject. And then recently I actually taught at Harvard a course on this subject. And I remember about 10 years ago when I was on the faculty, I actually taught a seminar on Afghanistan in which some of the matters that have now cropped up were examined.
Really?
And I was in fact today with the director of the programs at the Center for International Affairs, that's the Harvard think tank, Foreign Affairs, and I discussed the possibility of their having me again. They said they would. So I think the understanding, the comprehension of what is an Islamic state needs to be examined. I might put here in parentheses that this is not something you can learn quickly. You said something very true, which is that there's a rush in book stores to buy books. And I saw in a TV program last night that it was said that people were reading the Quran. These are not something you can just learn in a day and then know what the thing is. These are very difficult matters.
Exactly, and I think, I think that that can really be said about everything, and
Right.
especially in the United States. I think the United States are leaders because of the media, as far as always just they can't get enough of one subject until all of a sudden they have exhausted themselves from that subject and goes on to something else. And it's, that's unfortunately it's the same thing right now. Islamic religion, would they be reading it if things hadn't changed differently?
No, I certainly believe and I hope that the United States government will this time make long-term plans of not leaving these countries in a haphazard manner, and ensuring that the governments that come into place are educated, erudite, far-sighted, and intellectual enough to understand the gravities. And most of the mess, I might say so with great respect, is because of the 1988 sudden withdrawal by the United States. Having ousted the Russians, they should have taken a more concrete manner, and the same is the case with Pakistan government. Pakistan government might support them for their own reasons, as I have outlined. But I think that is not really the solution unless we create in that country. Pakistan is, after all, a nuclear power. And I think a government must be there in that country which is truly representative of the people, which is educated, which is in line, is a modern state, is a secular looking state, which has proper bearings to keep in a world which is constantly under threat from rigid and anti-social elements.
Well, I want to thank you for being on Middlesex Update. You've been a wealth of information, and you're heading off to a seminar that you're speaking at?
Yes, I have been invited by the American Academy of Religious Freedom, and this was arranged some months ago, and at that time I didn't know what I was going to say would become so pivotal.
Right.
I was allocated the subject of Islamic fundamentalism, so I am going to speak in that. There are 5 or 6 experts that are coming about different religions, but I have no doubt that I think what I have to submit would be of tremendous interest given the international gravity of the situation as it is today.
Well,
I'm very happy to be here.
Well, we're happy to have you here. I'm glad you had a safe trip, and we'll have to get you back on the program again sometime soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hassan.
Thank you very much.